I'm Megan Barnard, the Ransom Center's Associate Director for Administration and Curatorial Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here. The past week has been very busy at the Ransom Center as we opened our new exhibition, live from New York, the Lorne Michaels Collection, which is drawn from the extensive archive that Lorne Michaels donated to the Ransom Center last year. The festive activities taking place over the past week included opening celebrations for the UT campus community and for Ransom Center members. We also had the great pleasure of sharing and celebrating the exhibition with Lorne Michaels himself and with many of his family members and friends. Throughout these activities, while walking through the exhibition, it was impossible not to hear so many people sharing with their friends and colleagues their own personal stories about Saturday Night Live and Lorne Michaels. It seems that everyone, no matter their age or their background, feels connected in some personal way with this show and the history that surrounds it. And people seem to want to talk about those personal connections with the people in their lives. We're delighted to build on those conversations about Lorne Michaels and his storied career with our event this evening. Tonight, we have the special privilege to hear from Susan Morrison about the enormous task she took on in writing the biography of Lorne Michaels, a famously enigmatic figure who, though deeply immersed in our culture and well known to many, has avoided the press and guarded his privacy closely throughout his career. Morrison has crafted a deeply researched story that took nearly a decade to complete and was based on hundreds of interviews and conversations, including dozens with Michaels himself. She structures the narrative creatively, interweaving the story of a typical week in the creation of one episode of television's longest-running variety show with the life story of the man who has been at the helm of Saturday Night Live for 50 years. The result is a thoroughly smart, engaging, and informative biography of a figure who has been compared at various times to the Wizard of Oz, Thomas Edison, P.T. Barnum, Alfred Hitchcock, and even William Shakespeare. As Morrison notes in her book, Michaels, quote, views Shakespeare as the ultimate problem solver for the way he saw to it that, despite any obstacle, the show would go on. When Lorne was visiting last week and exploring some of our collections, he seemed to especially enjoy looking through the Ransom Center's copies of Shakespeare's First Folio. Susan Morrison is the articles editor of The New Yorker. She was previously the editor-in-chief of The New York Observer and an original editor of Spy magazine. And before that, she worked as the head writer's assistant for The New Show, a sketch comedy show produced by Lorne Michaels in 1984. When she was 16 years old, she was in Studio 8H for the live airing of one of the shows hosted by Elliott Gould during Saturday Night Live's inaugural season. So she's been there from the start. Morrison will speak with us this evening about her book, Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live. You can see it here, which was published by Random House last February and quickly became a New York Times bestseller. Following her presentation, she's kindly agreed to take questions from the audience, and I'm sure you'll have many great questions. After the program, we'll have copies of the book for sale in the lobby, and we hope you'll join us for a book signing and reception. The gallery will be open this evening, so please explore the exhibition. There's quite a lot to see in it, but the exhibition will be on view through March 20th, so you have plenty of time to come back again and again. And our exhibitions are always free. I'd like to thank the many wonderful colleagues at the Ransom Center who made this event possible. We're grateful to all of you for joining us tonight, and we're especially grateful to Susan Morrison for sharing this book with us and for speaking with us this evening about how this monumental project came into being. Please join me in welcoming Susan Morrison.
Thank you so much, Megan, and I hope you all have a chance tonight, if you haven't done so, to look at the exhibit. I walked through it, and I swear it was kind of like a three-dimensional acid flashback of my last decade. It's really an amazing piece of work. Now, before I talk to you about the book, I thought I would just start by reading just the first page so that you kind of get a sense of the flavor of it. So here we go. Every week at Saturday Night Live is just like every other week. Every week is the same because it's always intense, fueled by insanely hard work, full of triumphs and failures and backstage explosions, and because it's built around a guest host, Jennifer Lopez or Lizzo or Elon Musk, who often has no idea what they are doing. It has been Lorne Michaels' job for the last 50 years to make it seem as if they do, and to corral the egos and the talents on his staff into getting the show on the air live. Since he created the show in 1975, he has periodically tweaked and fine-tuned it, paying attention to how the cultural winds are drifting. But the formula has essentially remained the same. Michaels compares it to a Snickers bar. Viewers expect a certain amount of chocolate, a certain amount of peanuts, a certain amount of caramel. There's a comfort level, he says. The show has good years and bad years, like the New York Yankees or the Dow, and the audience has come to feel something like ownership of it. Just about every person who has ever watched SNL believes that its funniest years were the ones when they were in high school. Michaels likes to say that everyone in the entertainment business has two jobs, their actual job and figuring out how to fix SNL. When J.D. Salinger died in 2010, letters surfaced in which even he griped about what was wrong with the show. The show's cast members and writers have speculated for years about the secret behind Michaels' extraordinary tenure. It's him and Hitchcock, John Mulaney says. No one else has had this kind of longevity. Half of them believe that Michaels has repeatedly been able to remake the show for a new audience because he's a once-in-a-lifetime talent, a producer nonpareil. The other half wonders whether Michaels, gnomic and almost comically elusive, is a blank screen onto which they've all projected a lifetime of hopes and fears and dark jokes. Whether he, like the cramped stages in SNL's Studio 8H, is just a backdrop for the ever-shifting brilliance of the country's best comic minds. Before I start, is this distance good? Okay. So whenever I talk to people about the process of writing this book, they're always intrigued to hear that, having been an editor for 40 years, I published my first book the same month I applied for Medicare. A lot of people are finding that inspiring, so there you go. So how did I decide to jump off this crazy cliff so late in life? I'm not entirely sure, but I'll try to explain the best I can. 10 years ago, like a lot of you, I'm sure, I watched the SNL 40th anniversary special, and I found myself not just laughing, but really moved. Lorne Michaels, I realized, has been responsible for what many, many generations of Americans find funny, and it's a lot more than talking around the water cooler on Monday morning. It's a lot more than kids saying, "I'm a wild and crazy guy," or "I'm not worthy." I realized then, after watching the show, that without SNL, the kind of sardonic, sly worldview that we've come to associate with David Letterman or Jon Stewart, the late lamented Stephen Colbert, and the almost late lamented Jimmy Kimmel, it's hard to imagine that worldview. The attitude that SNL and Lorne have popularized, which I think of as a kind of a willingness to not take the world too seriously, a mixing up of the ridiculous and the awful. That has, for better or for worse, become our default position. So after watching the show, I I realized someone should write a book about this guy, and somehow I decided that it should be me. I mean, I'd known Lorne very slightly because when I was in my 20s, as Megan said, I worked as an assistant on The New Show, which was his one spectacular public failure. The show, the job only lasted a few months, but I befriended a lot of interesting people and writers there, Steve Martin, Jack Handy, and others who continued to write for me in my decades as a magazine editor. And all these years I had been hearing these writers and staffers at SNL talk about Lorne in this obsessive way, and they kind of alternated between like demonizing him and lionizing him, and as Megan said, they compared him to the Wizard of Oz, the Godfather, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Some called him the Darth Vader of comedy. And I knew that he rarely talked to the press. Somehow he had been able all these years to put himself across as being simultaneously a patriarch and a rebel. And I just decided that he was this potent, mysterious figure hiding in plain sight. And I figured that I was just going to have a stab at writing a book about him. So here's how I went about it. First, I sold a proposal to Random House, and then I went to see Lorne in his office. Now, he never asked for a biography to be inflicted on him. And when I told him I was writing one, he looked like he was going to have a coronary. Now, anyone who's read the book knows that the thing Lorne dislikes more than anything else is surprises. He's a producer. That means he always wants to have his hands on the wheel. So I told him I didn't need anything from him. He knew I was well connected in his world, but that if he wanted to talk to me, I thought that the book would be richer and better and, just reflect his legacy better. So, it wasn't a terrible meeting. We chit-chatted a bit, and I think he just hoped that it would all go away, but we agreed to meet for a drink a few days later. And so we did that, and I came fully in negotiating mode. I thought I was going to have to be twisting his arm, talking him into this, but he shocked me by just sitting down and just starting off telling stories. Madonna, Milton Berle, Joey Heatherton, he was just going. And this was this phenomenon that I would come to learn about from people like Seth Meyers and others who said very often when you're talking to Lorne about something important, it feels like you skipped over a conversation and just landed in the middle of something else. This often is what happens when people get hired. Like no one ever tells them that they're hired. They're just suddenly there at the show. So that's what this was. It was like, oh, he's all in, and he didn't ask me for anything. He didn't have any conditions or any restrictions. And I, of course, I was not prepared for this. I didn't have a notepad or a tape recorder. So I kept excusing myself to go to the ladies' room to scribble things down on a Con Ed bill. But anyway, we were off. This was about 10 years ago. And I've thought about it a lot since. And one reason that I think he decided to throw in with me, it had to do with an old New Yorker connection that I thought literary types like the Ransom Center crowd would want to hear about. And that was that in the first season of Saturday Night Live, Lillian Ross, the legendary New Yorker writer who had profiled Hemingway and Chaplin and Godard and Truffaut, she took Lorne under her wing. She walked into the show one day in 1975 with her companion, William Shawn, who was the New Yorker's editor. They were both giant comedy fans, and they had come to see the show hosted by Richard Pryor. Now, this is a little-known fun fact that I love telling people. Shawn was such a comedy nut that later in his life, in his later years, his favorite movie was This Is Spinal Tap. It's true. So anyway, Lillian and Shawn showed Lorne around town. They showed him the ropes. They took him told him what restaurants to Edad. They would talk about their great pal, Jerry Salinger. And all of this was, as you can imagine, really heady stuff for a furrier's son from Toronto who was born Lorne Lipowitz. And Lillian Ross began, at that point, a decades-long project of writing a profile of Lorne for The New Yorker. She worked on it for years and years, but she never wrote it. She abandoned it when William Shawn was abruptly fired in 1987. But the two of them stayed in touch until Lillian's death in 2017. And Lorne knew, because I would bump into him around town now and then, he knew that Lillian and I were good friends and that I had been her editor for 20 years. So when I came to his office that day and dropped my bombshell, I think he decided that my book had a kind of a feeling of kismet about it, that I was picking up a thread that Lillian had left dangling, which was kind of a beautiful thing. So anyway, I started, and over the next 10 years, I interviewed Lorne almost 50 times at his office at 30 Rock, at his house in Amagansett, walking on the beach. Transcribing those tapes was really difficult with the crashing waves and the howling wind. And then I also talked to all of the smart and funny people in his orbit, the writers and the cast over all the years. And as I said, I'd been an editor all this time, so this kind of reporting was somewhat new to me. And one thing that helped get me through it was something that I always remembered hearing Robert Caro say when he talked to students. And this is a good thing for any of you aspiring reporters to note also, that on the top of every page of your reporter's notebook, just write in big letters, "Shut up." Because when you're talking to somebody like this, you're nervous. You want them to think you're smart, but you have to resist your impulse to fill the uncomfortable silence. You have to get them to talk. So anyway, it was a learning experience for me in all kinds of ways. But from editing so many interesting and brilliant writers at The New Yorker over the years, I had picked up a few other notes about reporting, and I'll go into a few of those for you now. One is the idea of using physical details, not just words, to tell your story. For instance, here's a bit from early in the book when I'm establishing for the reader what Lorne is like. A gleaming white asterisk, his Order of Canada rosette, is usually in his lapel, and on his right hand is a bulky gold signet ring set with a square red stone engraved with Sufi characters, which he bought in the 1970s at a junk shop in Santa Monica. It was an old imam's sealing ring, he told me. The guy I bought it from told me the inscription means, "with the luck of Ishmael." And Ishmael had no luck whatsoever. So it's a joke. It's a Sufi joke. You could open with this ring in Persia. So let's see if I can, Now, wait a minute, did I skip one? Oh, that's the one I want. Okay. So another device worth talking about is, especially to people who care about archives, is, this is the one I want, okay, is describing your character's surroundings as a way to kind of fill in the narrative. So this is an inventory of what's on Lorne's desk and in his office. Instead of the barren expanse that characterizes the average mogul's desk, Michael's is cluttered with framed photos and kitschy totems. A bobblehead doll of Yankees outfielder Paul O'Neill, a Bocar coffee can, it's the brand his mother drank, full of sharpened pencils, points up, a cut glass canister of Tootsie Rolls. He once made a nice profit investing in the company. Figurines of Bing Crosby and the Buddha, a green-shaded banker's lamp. A framed photo of a short man alongside a tall man in uniform, standing by a Lincoln Continental, commemorates the time in the 80s when he and his friend Paul Simon got pulled over outside Memphis with a lit joint in the car, and the state trooper, a fan of Simon's album Graceland, asked not for license and registration, but for an autograph. On another wall hangs an engraved plaque that Rosie Schuster, Michael's first wife and a writer on SNL's early seasons, stumbled on in a West Village antique shop in the 70s. It reads, "The captain's word is law." Now let's see. Oh. Now this picture, this is from 1975, and it is the first day he ever walked into Studio 8H. You can see he looks a little anxious. This is by Edie Baskin, who took a lot of the pictures in the exhibit. And in the same way that the Sufi ring that I just talked about tells a story, this duck brooch on Lorne's lapel I think is very interesting. He wore this every single day to the show in the 1970s. And I asked him about it once, and he said, "Oh, I bought it in the same junk shop where I got the ring," but he didn't really have any feelings about it. And it was Candice Bergen who, just on her own, when I interviewed her, said to me, "Have you ever thought about the duck pin?" She said, "Because what I think it means is that, he's the mother duck, we're all the brood, and he's like a duck kind of serenely moving across the surface of the water, but his legs are paddling furiously underneath, because that's what a producer does." And anyway, I think that's a very good analysis of it. So before this archive came all the way down to Texas, it was in a suburban basement in Connecticut. And I got to look at an awful lot of that trove. And among other treasures, and some of these are on display, there was a lot of letters from summer camp, scrawled in pencil. Summer camp was a very important thing in Lorne's life, you'll find if you read the book. But these letters gave me really interesting insight into his fraught relationship with his mother. She was a lot like Philip Roth's Sophie Portnoy. And Lorne told me at the very beginning, this is a quote from him, "She kept the compliments in a tightly lidded jar on a high shelf." Now, as I reported the book, I learned that a lot of comedians had difficult mothers. Johnny Carson, for instance, his was a really tough bird. And I remember once, I've read that Johnny Carson once sent his mom a mink coat to her in Omaha for Christmas. And she sent it back with a note, "Too fancy for Nebraska." I think Lorne had to deal with a lot of that same kind of emotional withholding. Now, also in the archive are just, were piles of news clips and photos describing Lorne's career before he started SNL. And because I'd never written a biography before, I hadn't realized this, but for a biographer, the most exciting part of the research is seeing what your character is up to before they walk onto the world stage. Because after that, they're in the spotlight, they become kind of common property. People write about them, people know about them. What's really, really crucial and fun is to figure out what made your person into, the person he is. And in this regard, Lorne's early life is just a gold mine. It was amazing for me to see how almost everything that happened to him in the first 30 years of his life led in some direct or indirect way directly to creating SNL. He started to feel to me almost like a character out of Dickens or some classic Bildungsroman. Everything was important. Everything was something that he filed away. For instance, his father died suddenly when Lorne was 14, which was, as you can imagine, a huge deal for him. And it was also formative in terms of his future management style. When his dad died, he developed a kind of catastrophic thinking. And what a producer does is he always sort of makes sure that everything is under control, that there are no surprises. That the lights are right, that the seating has been done. It made him a big picture person, a person with a clipboard. And after his father's death, another thing that happened is that he developed a habit that, he's 80 years old now, but I would say he still has it, which is seeking out father figures and powerful mentors. And later on, he also became a regular kind of father figure to many, many of the people who work for him. I can't tell you how many cast members and writers spent hours talking to me about, well, talking to their therapists and then talking to me about their daddy issues with Lorne. They all desperately crave his approval, and that's something that he has figured out how to use. That gets results. Part of his style has often been to kind of keep people slightly off balance. Conan O'Brien has a story that he likes to tell about his second year, maybe as a writer on the show. He would bump into Lorne in the corridor, and be terrified, and Lorne would just look at him and say, "Still with the show?" Anyway, so looking through this archive, I also got a detailed sense, as I said, of how he learned to be a producer, which is an obscure art with an even more obscure skill set. It all began, as I said, when he put on camps at summer camp, and then at the University of Toronto, and then later in Toronto with a writing partner, a law student that he met named Hart Pomerantz. This is Hart and Lorne, and boy, did I have a lot of fun just describing the weird 70s hair and wide lapels and wild clothes these two wore. So as young men breaking into show business, Lorne and Hart started with a series of incredibly dispiriting TV writing jobs in LA. It seemed that they were on every kind of lame variety show out there, shows hosted by people like John Davidson and Perry Como. And every time he started on one of these things, he thought, oh my God, this is a dead end. What am I doing? I should go back to Toronto and go to law school like my mother wants. But in every instance, he managed to learn something. I kept being reminded of the way Henry James describes his character, Isabel Archer, in A Portrait of a Lady. She was one on whom nothing was wasted. Lorne got something out of every disaster. And to give you a couple of examples, the first show in LA was writing for the beautiful Phyllis Diller show. Now, is anyone here old enough to remember Phyllis Diller? Good, okay. So Phyllis Diller was actually, pretty groundbreaking and ahead of her time, making fun of housewifery and things like that. But the show that Lorne and Hart wrote on, that she hosted, was very square, very middle of the road. Very often the show would end with Phyllis serenading one of her guest stars, like Ernest Borgnine, on the alto saxophone. It wasn't like the Doors, who were playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go down the street, So, but Lorne learned a very important thing when he was working for Phyllis Diller. So when the show debuted, the producers immediately recognized that the audience just didn't like Phyllis Diller. She was too harsh and abrasive, and they felt also that the audience was not ready to see a woman in control, a woman hosting a show, being the boss. And so they devised this idea where Phyllis would come out and interview before the tape rolled in front of her audience and just interview the guest host, just a sort of fireside chat kind of thing, to humanize her and feminize her. And it was one of Lorne's jobs to pre-interview these guests and then give Phyllis the questions on index cards. But he told me, you could draw a direct line from that Phyllis Diller fireside chat segment and the reason why every episode of SNL opens with a host monologue, right? Because, so you're in the audience and this huge movie star comes out and Lorne wants people to feel kind of comfortable with that person. He doesn't want you to think, oh, this is some superhero from, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but just a person who, is as close to the audience as I am to you. So that was just incredibly interesting to me, that he was gathering these threads as early as that. But the most important lesson in producing came when he had a writing job on Laugh-In, which was a hit show with a kind of a countercultural vibe and a zany, psychedelic aesthetic. And in the same way that SNL would a few years later, Laugh-In was famous for spawning catchphrases. You bet your bippy, sock it to me. And it was a #1 show, so you'd think that Lorne would be happy that, okay, now I'm finally working on a hip show. Except it was a miserable experience for him, and this is why. At Laugh-In, the writers worked out of a motel miles from the studio. They were in a motel room by themselves, churning out one-liners, which would then just kind of go into the maw. And then they would be rewritten and rewritten again by several head writers. And Lorne said you never even knew if you got anything on the air till you watched the show on Monday night in the hotel room, in the motel room. So, and I'm sure the other thing that made it unfun for him is that he was miles away from any of the glamour. He didn't get to meet any of the stars or see any of the process. So when he started dreaming up a show in his head, the perfect show, because he started thinking, gee, I'd like to do my own show. The one thing he knew he would do differently is that he would make the writers the center of the process. He told me, I became a producer to protect my writing, which was always being fucked over by producers. So at SNL, writers would be king. And when he conceived the show, he told me that he thought of it almost as a magazine, where different writers would have distinct voices that would be recognizable to the audience. And he said that he had the New Yorker in mind specifically. In the same way that you pick up an issue of the New Yorker and you say, oh, that's a Larry Wright piece, and that's a Gia Tolentino piece, that he wanted his viewers to be able to say, oh, that's a Michael O'Donoghue sketch, or that's a sketch by Ann Beats. So, at SNL today, writers, always, this started in the beginning, they have always had a huge amount of creative control. They not only write the pieces, but they pick the costumes for their own sketches. They work with the set designers. They have total control until Saturday night. And I often think about how Lorne is kind of inadvertently, it's sort of an inversion of the old Hollywood joke about the starlet who was so stupid that she slept with the screenwriter. In Lorne's world, the writer is the top of the heap. Now, John Mulaney, who wrote for the show for some years, told me that when you have a sketch on the air at SNL, for 5 minutes, NBC is yours. This is a far cry from the situation in the motel in Burbank. And this is also why SNL's writer's room produces way more than its share of showrunners, directors, producers, because they've had so much responsibility. This is why you have Amy Poehler in Parks and Rec, and Tina Fey in Mean Girls, and Greg Daniels in The Office. The idea here, which imbues so much of Lorne's style as a manager, is to give artists ownership of their own material. Now, this is a card he kept on his bulletin board for inspiration at SNL. It's a comic manifesto. Now, as I mentioned, when he started out in LA in TV was kind of a hokey backwater, lagging behind the movies and music. TV was the Flying Nun and Lawrence Welk. And it wasn't until he met Lily Tomlin, who he found somebody who had the same kind of vision as he did for what television could be. Lily Tomlin was better established than Lorne was at this time, and she invited him to be a writer on a comedy special that she was doing. And they bonded immediately. One thing that they both told me was that how it drove them crazy in the early 70s. If you were watching a Bob Hope special and the characters, they decided if there was a sketch about marijuana, the characters who were supposed to be stoned just acted drunk because the people putting the show together didn't know the difference, and this was the kind of thing that Lorne and Lily wanted to fix. I mean, they liked the idea of the old-fashioned variety show format, which is as old as vaudeville. They just wanted to update it with the concerns of their generation. They wanted sketches about sex and drugs and rock and roll and politics, of course. This was the year after Watergate. Now, by comparison, the Carol Burnett show, which was on the air at the time and was a huge hit, their sketches were about PTA meetings and divorce and, the garage door breaking, middle-aged stuff. And when Lorne pitched the show, he had in his head to executives, he always referred to it as new wine in old bottles. He liked it's the Snickers bar thing. He liked the format, but he wanted to update the content. Now, the archive also contained mail, postcards, letters from all kinds of people, and you can see these in the exhibit downstairs. The poet Rod McEwen, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Stephen Eady, there's even something that seemed like a vague threat from Charles Manson. And when these things came, Lorne always just posted them on the bulletin board. So anyway, after years of going through the archive and talking to, Lorne and all of the other people involved, as I finally started to write, I realized that a built-in hazard when you're writing a biography is that if you're not careful, it can start to seem, kind of like a death march through the years. 1985 turns into 1986. And so that's why this structure that Megan talked about, I realized that I needed to do something to kind of liven it up for the reader. And so I asked Lorne if I could embed with him for a week at the show and just be at his elbow, see everything just as he saw it, be in all the meetings. As a magazine editor, I always tell my writers that I want pieces to have scenes in them. I want you to bring the reader into the room with the subject and see what they're wearing and hear what people are saying and get a sense of being there. And I knew that would really be helpful for my reader. So again, to my surprise, Lorne said yes, and I was there every day for a week when Jonah Hill was hosting. And it turned out to be the smartest thing I did because it gave the book this kind of propulsive structure. The first chapter is Monday in Lorne's office at 30 Rock, and chapter 2 is Lorne as a little boy freezing in Toronto in the 1940s, watching Sid Caesar on TV. And with this days of the week structure, someone told me that it was called a braided narrative. I hadn't even realized that. But it drives the story forward, and it builds to the emergency room atmosphere of Saturday night. And, by Wednesday at the show, and this is about midway through the book, as sketches are cut and winnowed, it starts to feel like the Hunger Games there. So there's a real sort of built-in stress. And a lot of very interesting things ended up happening the week that I was there. Alec Baldwin got arrested. It wasn't the shooting arrest. This was, thankfully, a more comedic arrest having to do with punching somebody over a parking place. But that's good copy, as we say. And I also got to hear everybody talking a lot about Donald Trump. It was Trump's first term, and they were telling a lot of funny stories about what happened when he had hosted in 2015 when he was a candidate. And in one sketch, Colin Jost told me about this, Trump was supposed to play a tree standing next to the giving tree, the Shel Silverstein character who gives and gives of herself until she's reduced to a stump. And the sketch was supposed to end with a Trump tree calling the giving tree a sucker. Now, Trump, in the end, refused to do the sketch, but not because it portrayed him as heartless, but because he thought the tree costume made him look fat. Anyway, the days of the week chapter notion also allows me to show readers how Lorne, what he does as a producer, how he uses his kind of recessive charisma, his sort of laid-back deadpan to perform this kind of jujitsu that he does that allows him to get the best out of people and to get them to do what he wants to do. I really got to watch up close his sort of the intuitive way that he wields power. When I was reporting, one agent told me that she routinely tells her clients, if they're auditioning for Lorne, to always remember that he is the real star of the show. As Bill Hader told me, there's so many people who their whole lives have just been trying to figure him out. And even after they leave the show, he looms really large in their psyches. Many told me that they dream about him all the time. And in the photo insert of my book, I have some examples of how, this enduring fascination with him continues even after people leave the show. So I'll show you some of these. A lot of SNL writers go on to The Simpsons, and they love putting Lorne in the show. He has been in The Simpsons like 3 or 4 times. Now, this is a Harvard Lampoon dinner poster. A lot of Lampoon people write for the show, and so I think sometime in the 90s, the kids up there said, well, let's invite Lorne up and have a banquet for him, and they made this poster. I'm sure trying to get jobs was not part of the idea there, but anyway, so this hangs in the Lampoon Castle now. Whoops, did we skip one? Oh, okay. This one is, I took this with my cell phone, that's why it looks this terrible. I was at the show once, I think it was Lorne's 75th birthday, and Harry Styles was the host. And he loves Lorne, and he had designed and had a bakery make a special cake for Lorne that was of Studio 8H, and he made Lorne out of marzipan standing in the middle of it. And this is the cake. And at the end of the show, it was wheeled into the hallway outside of Studio 8H. And I showed this picture to Lorne. The sad thing is he never even got to see this cake because the crew ate it before he had a chance to get near it. And now this I love also. Tom Davis, brilliant, especially beloved of Lorne, writer for the show from the very beginning, and half of Franken and Davis. He wrote a memoir some years ago, actually a very good book. I really recommend it. And at his book party, he had an ice sculpture in the shape of Lorne's head, which I'm sure it only lasted another hour or so after that. So hanging around the office as much as I did, I also got to see lots and lots of people do their impersonations of Lorne, which is something that's been going on since the 80s. It started out in the writer's room as a way to kind of writers to blow off steam in the tension of deadlines. And everyone seems to do one these days. I'm sure you know that Dr. Evil in Austin Powers is loosely based on an impression that Dana Carvey used to do backstage. Now I'm going to show you a couple video clips of some more arcane imitations, and there isn't a break between them, so I'll tell you. The first is Jimmy Fallon. The second is Bill Hader imitating Lorne if he were name-dropping serial killers. The third is Mike Myers as Dr. Evil, and the fourth is Mark McKinney from the brilliant Canadian comedy troupe Kids in the Hall, which Lorne produced. And it's from their movie Brain Candy, where Mark plays an executive based entirely on Lorne.
Just go in to the room and just somebody walks you out of the office.
I went to Kansas City with Alec and Marcy to try to get BTK killer off death row. They said, "Here comes BTK." I go, his name's Dennis. He's a human being.
There really is nothing like a shorn scrotum. It's breathtaking. I suggest you try it.
Can I get you anything else, Chris? Grappa, wine, cappuccino, tickets to a Lakers game?
No thanks, Doc.
Are you sure? What about cheesecake? AA batteries? Land in Montana?
The phrase "land in Montana" is a kind of a secret. You know, if you say that to any comedy writer in the world, they will laugh. They will know this particular bit. That's seen as the ultimate Lorne line, "land in Montana." So there's actually a whole chapter in my book called "The Make Fun of Lorne Show." You know, his persona is a great catalyst for comedy, and he doesn't mind at all. You know, he likes to say that making fun of the boss is the most American thing there is. But then he adds in his very dry way that they don't do it much in Canada because no one there is that successful. So, now, Megan talked about how much Lorne liked seeing the first folio of Shakespeare, which didn't surprise me because he does have, he talked to me a lot about Shakespeare, and he's a voracious reader he reads everything. But, there's a kind of he has a kind of endearing grandiosity, which I think is entirely earned. And the Shakespeare comparison, he's worked it out in great detail. He likes to note that Shakespeare first had to get his work approved by the Lord Chamberlain and the monarch, the network bosses of their day, right? And then he had to scramble to get the show on the boards, just like a week at SNL, kind of hurtling towards Saturday. And one of the things that Lorne says every single week is, we don't go on because we're ready. We go on because it's 11:30. And Shakespeare's deadline wasn't 11:30, but it was sunset. Lorne talks about Shakespeare shaving minutes from Hamlet to get the play over by dark, just like he shaves minutes from SNL sketches when the dress rehearsal runs long. And another thing that he says all the time, which I think is probably completely true, is he says, I know Shakespeare had a Belushi. That's why Falstaff appears in 3 plays. So I'm going to end with something that isn't in the Ransom Center's collection, although maybe one day. This is a portrait of Lorne painted by his Hamptons neighbor and friend, Eric Fischel, the great painter. And it was done a year or two after 9/11, and it hangs in the hall at Lorne's beach house. And I had a really interesting conversation with Eric Fischel about this that made me realize how similar our tasks were in trying to pin down this man who has always preferred to stay in the shadows. So Fischel said that to prepare to paint the portrait, he invited Lorne over and had a long, long conversation with him, just casually snapping photographs of him the whole time. And he said that during the conversation, Lorne was upbeat and funny, unspooling his showbiz stories about Danny Aykroyd this, and just go on. But then when Fischel had the film developed, he said he was so surprised that the guy in the photographs was not buoyant and self-possessed. He wasn't anything like the person he had been talking to in the studio. But he decided to paint what he saw on the film, which was a picture of a certain world weariness, a man coming to terms with getting older, managing enormous success, shouldering responsibility for so many people's lives and careers, and pondering what comes next. And he told me that when Lorne came over to his studio to look at the finished portrait, he just stared at it in silence for a long, long time. He got nervous. And then finally Lorne turned to him and he said, "How did you know?" So Fischel had really captured something in him, and I hope I have too. So thank you very much. So yes, we could take some questions now, right here.
Is that the ring?
Yes, that's the ring. And he also, he had replicas of this ring made for his 3 children and his wife. So they all have the Persian joke on their hands. right here.
Did he have some specific relationship to Austin or the University of Texas to choose here?
No, I think that there were two reasons. One is, De Niro's papers are here. De Niro lived in Lorne's building for a long time, and they're friends. And I bet De Niro might have put the idea in his head. But more than that, I think that, as I said, Lorne is a really literary guy, and I think he loved the idea probably of having his things be near, Shakespeare's first folio and the papers of Ian McEwan and Joyce and of course the Ernest Lehman collection. I think in a way the holdings of this place so perfectly mirror many of Lorne's preoccupations that it's just a natural fit. Over there? That's you.
I am a longtime Chicagoan, and I'm not old enough to have been at Second City when Belushi was there, Bill Murray, and so on. But I'm curious to know what role Second City played in his life in Saturday Night Live. Being from Canada, I assume it's the Toronto version of Second City that was probably bigger than Chicago. But even extending that a little further, the Second City that I know, and I lived half a block from Second City, so I could crawl home if I needed to, is all about improvisation. And just his control instincts kind of say to me, he loved the sketch comedy, which I think is a big part of Saturday Night Live, but would abhor the improvisation part.
Yeah, well, those are two good questions. I'll try. The first is, Lorne has a theory, and Tina Fey talks about this in her wonderful book, Bossy Pants, because she learned everything about how to manage creative people from Lorne. And he always liked a balance among his staff of Chicago comedy people, I'll use that as shorthand for Second City, which he always considered more kind of physical, emotional, expressive, like comedy, and the sort of Harvard Lampoon people, which was a brainier kind of, sketches about medieval doctors and Vikings and, a lot of brainy stuff, and that the combination of that is kind of, like chocolate meeting peanut butter. But in terms of improv, it's such a good question. People ask me all the time whether the show is improvised, because we live in this age of improv. When I was a kid, we all took piano lessons. Now every kid takes improv, right? But the show is done with such surgical precision. This is what I was talking about, the shaving the minutes, because it's live and the things have to end so the commercials can slot in. Everything is done with stopwatches, and if you improvise, that would just be a disaster. So Lorne appreciates and prizes the skills that come with improv, but not in terms of the performance. It's more, people improv when they're writing. Like the writer's room is like a big improv session. People just throwing things out and then somebody writing them down. But also, I think Danny Aykroyd said something really smart to me. He said the thing about improv players is that they're very good in an ensemble because they're trained to tune in to their fellows. You're really listening to each other, and it just works better as an ensemble. There have been years when the cast has been less successful, partly because too many of the players are stand-up comics, because the stand-up comic is just looking at the audience, just trying to get the audience to laugh. Doesn't care what's going on over there, So in that way, improv is a useful skill, just creatively. Oh, in the back, you?
Two quick questions. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Does Lorne like it when cast members crack up during the skit or not?
Well, the traditional answer to that is that he really hates it, and especially in the beginning, he used to say, "That's so Carol Burnett," and I have to defend Lorne, because when he says that, it's not anti-Carol Burnett, it's not sexist or anything. It's just that he felt that there was a kind of an unprofessional looseness about it. He really wants everything. It has to do with his respect for the writing and his respect for the script. Like, you read the script, you don't mess it up. that said, I mean, that's the starting point. But over the years, particularly after Fallon and Horatio Sands began this era of always breaking, as they call it, breaking character, I think he's gotten more forgiving of it. And these days when it happens kind of organically, and people sort of like it. And he's not really as strict about it. I think if somebody were really sloppy and did it all the time, he wouldn't like it.
And my second question, has he talked about retirement or who he would want to take his place? I know there's been talk about Tina Fey perhaps, or is it something more internal?
Well, Lorne has so many koans, or aphorisms on this subject. One is, when people leave show business? Never. No one ever leaves show business. Another thing he says is there are no heirs apparent in show business. I don't think he has any intention of ever walking away from there. I don't think he will be replaced wholesale at all. My theory, and I haven't tried this one out on him, but he's so good at delegating, and he has such squad of able deputies. I think that what's likelier is if it starts to be too much for him, I could imagine a scenario where he just comes in Wednesday for the read-through, when they pick the sketches, and then Saturday for the dress rehearsal. I could see him doing that into his 90s, and then leaving his deputies to run all the day-to-day stuff. But I just don't see somebody replacing him wholesale. The show is his whole life.
You think he'll have something in his will say, here are my choices, or he's going to keep going?
I don't know. I mean, it's NBC's property. They could do whatever they want. You?
Has there been politics, does he do some of the politics with NBC to keep the show going so long? Because I was just sort of thinking, 50 years, how do you do that without having, the executives and all sort of, they must have had doubts over the years.
The whole recent thing with Kimmel and Brendan Carr made me think a lot about Lorne's genius at, outlasting various boneheaded executives that he's had to deal with. He has this purely intuitive but very intelligent management style and there were times in the 90s in particular, and I think the exhibit alludes to this, when the executives were really not on his side. I mean, they almost fired him at one point. They tried to hire very young Judd Apatow to come in and train to take over for Lorne. And Lorne basically just kept his head down, pretended it wasn't happening, just went about his business. He has this way of deflecting conflict and just kind of kicking it down the road, not engaging. The writers of 30 Rock, Robert Carlock, one of the showrunners of that show, wrote a sketch for the Alec Baldwin characters, quasi based on Lorne. And there was an episode of 30 Rock called The Fabian Strategy, and that's from this Roman general, Fabius Maximus, who was famous for winning wars by attrition. He just basically never went into battle. And that is all based on Lorne's management style. And I think it is one of the reasons that he has hung on through everything. And he told me something, in terms of what I was saying about lessons learned along the way. In the 70s, the Smothers Brothers got canceled. The Smothers Brothers getting pulled off the air was the only other time something like this Kimmel thing has happened. Nixon told CBS to cancel their show because they wouldn't stop hammering on the Vietnam War. And they had been told to rein it in. They didn't rein it in. They kept going, and they got canceled, and they were martyrs. And then a few years after that, they had a comeback show at the Troubadour in LA. Lorne went to that show. And here they were, these free speech heroes. In the audience that night was John Lennon, and with Harry Nilsson. John Lennon was completely drunk. And he was friends with the Smothers Brothers. But they get up and they're doing their big heroic comeback show, and John Lennon is heckling them, screaming at them, calling them fuckers, telling them to get off the... And Lorne said that he sat there in the audience that night and he just realized nothing good comes from being a martyr, you know? You're a martyr, you lose your airwaves, you lose your ability to do what you want to do, to tell your story. And in a culture, in a showbiz culture that will just sell you out, you know, just a few years later, this mother's brother, you know, just that everyone had forgotten. I think he found that really chilling. And it imbued him with this feeling of no matter what you do, keep your hands on the wheel and keep your franchise, you know, just keep, you know, so that, like, I'm fascinated to see how Weekend Update is going to handle this. And I'm sure they will not shy away from it. I'm sure they'll handle it. They'll hit it head on. But I bet it will be some kind of very intelligent, conceptual thing that, you know, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see, but he's certainly not going to throw himself in the volcano, you know. Oh, wait, you already had one. Let's see if there's anyone else first. Over there.
Involved at all in the Saturday night movie that recently came out?
No, the Ivan Reitman movie. No, Jason Reitman. No, I wasn't. I went to see it, and you know, I found it entertaining, although the journalist part of my head was kind of exploding because it was like watching an Oliver Stone movie, you know, about comedy. It was because so much of it was inaccurate. But I think that it got the sort of energy of the show. But I was fascinated to talk to some of the young people who work on the show now about the movie. They were all very indignant about it. Lorne said he didn't see it, but they said it's like watching. It's like, let's say you're a rock band. It's like seeing somebody fuck up your song at karaoke. That's how they felt. They were very territorial about it. Right here.
Your book was brilliant.
Thank you.
I listened to it, and I was wondering. I guess the narrator was Kristen DiMercurio.
Yes.
How did you find her?
Oh, well, the publisher gave me a bunch of voices to listen to, and I liked her best, and I picked her. But there's kind of a funny story. Then she did a sample chapter, and they sent that to me. And in the chapter, because it quotes Lorne a lot, her Lorne, I mean, I haven't listened to the whole book, so I don't know what it's like. But in the first version I heard, when she was reading Lorne's voice, she made him sound like some big macho Gary Cooper guy out of a Western. And I just said, no, that is not what Lorne sounds like. And I sent her clips of him, but I told her to watch The Jungle Book. And the George Sanders character, you know, he plays Shere Khan, the tiger. He's kind of this very, you know, just very low powered, Jack Benny-ish, kind of ironic. And that's what I advised her to go for. How does she do? Does she nail it? Oh, good. Okay.
And she's consistent through the whole thing. She doesn't go to another accent. She was terrific. Thank you. It was great.
Back there, yeah.
Did he have a favorite guest or an entertainer? I mean...
Well, I mean, he has, you know, one of the things in the Make Fun of Lorne show is how many fabulous celebrity friends that he has. So, you know, Conan O'Brien invented a game in the writer's room called Which Paul, which is, so when Lorne's talking about Paul, how do you figure out if it's Paul Simon or Paul McCartney? You know, so no, I mean, he loves it when Paul McCartney or Paul Simon host. I mean, they're his best friends. And, you know, he loves Emma Stone. There's some young people that he loves. You know, the ones who, you can tell because they're the ones who come back and host repeatedly. But I don't know that I could single out just one. Right there in the hat.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh. What was most surprising to you after spending so much time with him? You said he's a very private person. What was most surprising to you about who he was as a person rather than the public image we know of him?
Well, I mean, this might not be exactly what a lot of people. Lorne has this reputation in the business as a certain kind of hard-bitten comedy professional who, because there are these people in the comedy business who don't laugh, but who just say, "That's hysterical." And that's not true at all. He's really funny. You know, he laughs, and he himself is funny all the time. I mean, one thing, he and I commiserated a fair amount, and I hope I'm not offending any young people in the audience, just about, issues with millennials in our offices. And he was telling me a story about, he produced Mean Girls on Broadway, and his friend Margaret Trudeau was coming to see it one night. He had got her tickets. And the young woman who was the lead in Mean Girls, had called in sick that night because she had to take her dog to the vet because the dog ate glue. Lorne was really pissed about that. And he said, if it was Patti LuPone, the dog would be dead. Which is what he thought should have happened. So, right there.
The gentleman in the back asked about some of his favorite guests, but did you have any insight about some of the more notorious, maybe bad guests, like Steven Seagal?
He never talked to me about any of that. I think because there's a lot of stuff like that just has become lore that's on the internet, people like Steve Seagal. I do know that he found Louise Lasser in the first season to be really trying, but I think she was, in the very beginning, you sometimes had guests who were really coked up, like her, or I think, why can't I? Chris Christopherson was apparently could barely stand up. He was so drunk. It was more unprofessionalism. But right here, you.
Susan, great book. Again, when I guess 10 years ago, about when it came out, there was an article that said there was going to be a biography, and you were writing it. I was very, very excited. And then 6, 7, 8 years later, I was like, gosh, I still hope that's happening. So it's beautiful. Thank you. I was going to ask about the sort of freedom of speech and the late night thing, but you hit upon that. So I guess what the other thing I was going to say is I really like how you sort of describe his persona, the things on the desk, kind of what he wears. Is there anything not in the book that you could share with us? Like, I'm always wondering, what is his drink of choice?
Well, so I worked on the book for so long that during the course of it, he stopped drinking. But in the beginning, his drink was always, he would have a Belvedere on the rocks. I think this is in the book, with a little sidecar of cranberry juice that he would put in the drink. And, over an evening, he would maybe have 3 of those. But I think since he turned 80, he's been drinking that quite good, athletic, non-alcoholic beer. I hope he has a drink every now and then. I haven't pushed him on it, but, I'm sure, like everybody, he's thinking about longevity. Right there.
I feel like for public people, for people like us, we always see him dressed up in, the button-up, the jacket, the slacks, the good shoes. Did you ever experience him super casually?
Well, I never saw him in shorts. No, it's funny. When I first started this, I remember some of the writers saying, you'll never see Lorne in a T-shirt or in a T-shirt with a logo on it. He's pretty fastidious. I think he spends a lot of money on clothes, but it's very, it'll be an expensive V-neck cashmere sweater and a pair of khakis, or a Ralph Lauren polo shirt and khakis or something. But there's another part of the book that I really enjoyed is everyone is obsessed with the gifts he gives. He's a very good gift giver. He spends a lot of time and a lot of money on just finding just the right gifts. And it's almost like wedding anniversaries, paper, silver, whatever. People say that the first year you're there, you'll get Simon Pierce crystal glassware, and the second year you'll get I can't think of the name of it. Oh, T. Anthony luggage. It goes on and on. I was once with the writer Jim Downey on his birthday, and this big box from Hermes arrived, and Jim opened it, and it was this cashmere sweater that was so luxurious that, Jim just looked at it and he said, I'm going to have to find a safety deposit box for this. So, what is the succession term? Quiet luxury? I think that's in the back there.
What is his approach to picking that last sketch of the night? Because it's always kind of an outlier.
Well, there's a whole vocabulary for the sketch that comes on at the very end of the show. It's often almost like a black box theater kind of experimental thing. They call it the 10-to-1 sketch. Some people call it Death Valley. Some people call it the Jack Handy slot, because it's something that it's usually the writer's favorite thing. It's something that's maybe really abstruse and strange and not everybody will get, but they want to reward it by running it. But you put the crowd-pleasing stuff on in the front of the show because you don't want people to change the channel. And very often those are wonderful sketches. But something, I was talking about the stopwatches. Something that I don't think people realize, and it is kind of insane, is that at 11:30, the night that Jonah Hill night that I was there, in the conference room with Lorne and two of his deputies, at 12:30. It's 12:30. The show's going to be over in half an hour. I had 40 minutes of material still. So they're sitting there, doing, it looks like studying for the SATs, people adding up columns of numbers and figuring out how many sketches could fit, and they're just cutting 2 sketches and, taking a minute out of this one and 4 seconds out of that one. And a lot of times it comes down to math even more than the content of the sketch. It's just what's going to fit. It's putting together a very elaborate puzzle. Now I see the lights went up. Does that mean that we should stop, or if there are more questions? Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. That was really wonderful. I hope you'll all join us in the lobby for a reception and a book signing. And please, once again, let's thank Susan for that.
Thank you.